The lights of the studio were too bright, a sterile glare bouncing off polished glass and glossy wood. Rows of cameras stood on their black tripods like silent guards, their red tally lights blinking steadily. Behind them, the audience was pressed close together, hundreds of faces under the heat of the stage lamps, expectant, restless. The smell of makeup and coffee clung to the air, mixed with the faint ozone from the equipment. The host had been gliding through the evening with the smooth rhythm of television. Introductions, applause, a few light jokes. The practiced cadence of someone who knew how to shepherd a crowd. But then the rhythm snapped. "Let's be honest," one of the reporters said, leaning forward in his chair. His voice was calm, but his eyes gleamed with mischief. The microphone in his hand caught the room like a net. He turned to Seagal, seated stiffly at the center of the couch. "You're not really a fighter. You're an actor who pretended on screen." The words hit the room like glass shattering. The applause machine cut off. The laughter froze. A hush rolled across the audience, a hush so complete that the buzz of the studio lights could be heard. Someone coughed too loudly in the back row. A few nervous laughs fluttered, but they died quickly. Even the producers, visible through the glass of the control booth, froze mid-gesture. This wasn't scripted. Seagal closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The lids pressed tight, as if holding something back. His hands, heavy on his thighs, flexed once. When he opened his eyes again, they looked darker, heavier, as though a storm had passed across them. He didn't answer immediately. His silence became its own spectacle. The reporter smirked at the tension, sensing the cameras had turned his way. He leaned back, the posture of a man enjoying his own gamble. "Come on," he said, chuckling nervously. "Tell us, how many of your tricks were real?" A ripple of reaction moved through the audience, half shocked, half entertained. The laugh carried an edge, a cruelty that demanded Seagal defend himself or collapse under the weight of it. The camera cut suddenly to the man seated one chair away, Chuck Norris. Unlike Seagal, Norris's face showed no flicker of irritation, no forced smile, no strain. His expression was steady, almost serene, the kind of stillness that carried weight precisely because it refused to move. His eyes, fixed on the reporter, didn't blink. The calm was unnerving. It made the jab land differently. In that moment, the room seemed to shift. The audience felt it, though no one spoke. The insult wasn't just hanging in the air anymore. It had been delivered into a space where silence was dangerous. People leaned forward, drawn by the tension between three men: the smirking reporter, the insulted Seagal, and the silent Norris. On Seagal's face, the struggle was visible. Pride fought with restraint. His lips pressed thin, jaw clenching so tightly the muscles trembled. He wanted to bite back, but some deeper instinct, maybe survival, maybe discipline, held him. The pause made him look both dignified and vulnerable at the same time. The reporter sensed his advantage. He let out a laugh that wasn't just nervous anymore. It was victorious. He was provoking, pushing, using Seagal's silence as fuel. His eyes flicked again toward Norris, almost daring him to intervene. The audience shifted uneasily. Some clapped weakly, supporting the reporter's boldness. Others booed, muttering, shaking their heads. The room was splitting in real time, energy bouncing unpredictably. A few in the back shouted words drowned by the echo of the studio. The control booth buzzed with frantic hand signals. A producer mouthed, "Move on," toward the host. But the host's face had gone stiff, eyes flicking between the guests. He knew there was no pulling this back. Seagal sat there, shoulders rigid, face pale under the lights, eyes burning darker by the second. His silence screamed louder than any defense. And next to him, Norris didn't so much as adjust in his chair. His calm wasn't neutrality. It was weight. The stillness of a man who didn't need to answer with volume because everyone in the room already felt the answer in their bones. The reporter laughed again, higher this time, like someone walking too close to the edge of a cliff but pretending not to notice the drop. He leaned forward, microphone pointed directly at Seagal. "Tell us, Stephen," he said, savoring the tension. "Are you going to say even half of it was real?" And then, as though pulled by the gravity of the silence, he swung the microphone toward Norris. "Or maybe you can tell us," the reporter said, smiling wide. "Even you wouldn't believe he's a real fighter, right?" The sound of the words snapped the audience into stillness. A collective inhale swept the studio, sharp, unified, fearful. They knew instinctively. This was the moment everything hinged on. The cameras zoomed tight on Norris's face, waiting for the smallest twitch, the faintest smile, a blink, anything. But there was nothing yet. Just that calm, steady silence, heavier than the bright lights, heavier than the laughter that had tried to cut the air. The pause stretched long enough for the audience to feel it in their chests, the kind of silence that grows louder than shouting. Everyone leaned in. And though no words had been spoken yet, the confrontation had already begun. "Just wondering. Where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello." The silence lingered, thick enough to press against the chest. The reporter's microphone hung in the air like a weapon, the grin on his face daring either man to move. Around them, the audience stirred, voices breaking into fragments, laughter, jeers, applause that sputtered into boos. The studio had stopped being entertainment. It had turned into a trial. Seagal sat rigid, shoulders squared, the muscles in his jaw visibly tight. His eyes were locked on the floor for a moment, then rose slowly, catching the reporter's gaze with a look heavy enough to erase the man's smile for half a beat. But Seagal said nothing. His silence only fueled the tension. It wasn't resignation, it was defiance, the kind that forces everyone else to decide what it means. The reporter took advantage. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle crossed over the other, the posture of a man convinced he owned the moment. He turned slightly, flashing his grin toward the cameras, basking in the uneasy applause from a corner of the audience. His self-satisfaction was palpable. A man who believed that by poking hard enough, he could make legends bleed in public. Chuck Norris hadn't moved. The weight of his stillness was beginning to eclipse everything else. The audience felt it, leaning forward, whispering. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning. He was simply there, his presence a counterpoint to the noise around him. The reporter sensed the eyes of the room shifting, so he sharpened his attack. He swung the microphone toward Norris and pressed again, his voice louder this time. "Even you," he said, letting the words hang. "Even you don't believe this man is a real fighter. Isn't that true?" The air fractured. The studio filled with gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a sudden hush layered over by the rising hum of voices. The crowd had become the third participant, their reactions louder than the stage directions. A group in the front row clapped and whistled, supporting the jab. Others booed, their voices raw with disapproval. The clash of reactions built into a storm, and the reporter smiled wider, feeding on it. Seagal's face darkened. He didn't lash out, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed the effort it took to stay still. His pride was on the line, his body screaming for a retort, yet he chose restraint. The silence radiating from him was almost unbearable. It was the silence of someone who knew that no matter what he said, it would be twisted. So he let the weight of his gaze speak instead. But the crowd wasn't satisfied with silence. Their hunger grew. They turned toward Norris. Whispers turned into chants, soft at first, then louder, voices rising in unison. "Answer! Answer!" They wanted him to break the tension, to pick a side, to strike not with fists, but with words. The host shifted uneasily in his seat, clutching his cue cards. The control booth flared with frantic hand signals, but none of it mattered. The cameras were fixed, locked tight on Norris. Every lens in the room seemed to say the same thing. "We're waiting." The reporter chuckled nervously, though his eyes flickered with unease. He repeated louder this time. "Come on, Chuck, don't leave us hanging. What do you really think? Is he a fighter or just a performance? The audience erupted, half cheering the provocation, half hissing their disapproval. The studio floor shook with the weight of hundreds of voices colliding. Someone shouted from the balcony, "Say it, Chuck!" And laughter followed, sharp as a knife. Still, Norris did not answer. His eyes, steady and unblinking, remained fixed on the reporter. The stare itself was a response, one that carried more menace than raised voices ever could. The longer it lasted, the more unbearable the silence became. It was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with expectation, filled with threat. Seagal lifted his head slowly. His gaze shifted from the reporter to Norris, searching. In that look was something raw, recognition. Seagal understood that Norris's silence wasn't indifference. It was judgment and maybe protection. He saw in him the one man who might restore balance to a situation already spiraling. The audience felt it too. Their shouts began to die down, replaced by a nervous anticipation. A hush spread, rolling outward like a ripple on water. Even the producer in the booth stopped waving his arms. Every sound drained away until only the hum of the studio lights remained. The reporter, unsettled by the stillness, laughed again. This time it cracked at the edges. "What is this?" he demanded, forcing bravado back into his tone. "Are you both hiding behind words, too afraid to give a real answer?" That line landed like a slap. The audience erupted once more, some jeering, others booing, the divide sharper now. The noise became a physical presence, rising and falling, demanding resolution. Norris finally shifted, just a lean forward, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes narrowing slightly. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, not amusement, but something colder. The camera caught it instantly, zooming tight. The room held its breath, and in that frozen second, before a single word left his lips, the moment became immortal. The image of Norris leaning forward with that quiet, cutting smile was enough to set the internet ablaze before the show had even gone off air. But the real answer was still hanging in the air, waiting to strike. The red tally light fixed on Chuck and refused to blink. A camera crane floated in slowly, lens hovering just above his shoulder for a close-up. In the control booth, someone whispered, "Hold on him," and the studio obeyed. The crowd felt it too. Something was about to break. The murmurs dropped into a taut hush. The reporter, suddenly giddy with attention, straightened in his chair. He flashed a grin toward the audience, but it didn't land. All eyes had shifted to Chuck. Even the host, fingers crumpling his cue cards, leaned back to give the camera a clearer angle. Beside them, Steven Seagal stayed motionless, chin tucked, eyes low, waiting for a change in the air. Chuck breathed once, slow. He lowered his gaze to his hands, flat on his knees, then raised it and locked on the reporter. The hush deepened. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, almost conversational, yet it carried through the rafters. "I know one thing," he said. "Respect defines a fighter more than strikes. No flourish, no emphasis, just the line, placed like a stone in water." The reaction wasn't immediate applause. It was breath, sharp and collective, then a low murmur rippling through the rows. The words didn't satisfy hunger for spectacle, but they carried weight. People shifted in their seats, as if adjusting to a truth they hadn't expected. Seagal's head rose. He turned to Chuck and held his eyes. Something in his expression eased, not relief, not triumph, but recognition. For the first time that evening, he looked less alone. The reporter tried to snatch the moment back with a laugh that rang too high. "So that's it, hiding behind words," he said, gesturing for support. He drew scattered applause, some whistles, but no surge. The crowd was no longer his. From the balcony, someone shouted, "Say it, Chuck!" Another voice cut in angrily, "Don't dodge!" The audience had become part of the duel, their voices clashing like waves. The host muttered half a segue, but his teleprompter sat frozen, useless. The producers behind the glass gestured frantically, then gave up. Seagal exhaled, his shoulders dropping slightly. His eyes didn't move from Chuck. Whatever else was happening, he had found the only anchor in the room. The reporter pressed harder. Respect? That's not an answer. People want to know what's real. His words trembled with impatience, more plea than command. A boom operator inched his mic toward Chuck. The pole quivered. A dolly camera crept closer until Chuck's face filled the monitors, lights catching in his pupils, the faint gray stubble along his jaw. The audience fractured further. Some clapped at the word respect, grateful for substance. Others hissed, impatient for spectacle. The room was split into two hungers, blood and dignity. Chuck stayed still. He let the storm churn and then recede on its own. Only when the noise thinned did he lean forward, elbows on his knees, and speak again. "You're confusing attention with truth," he said, quiet, deliberate. Not the same thing. This time applause broke quickly, layered with boos. The mix shook the walls. The crowd wasn't united, but they were fully awake. The reporter forced a grin. "Then answer straight," he snapped, microphone thrust forward. "Is he a fighter or not?" The command booth mouthed cut to break, but even they held off. The room wanted the answer. Seagal's fists unclenched slowly on his knees. He wasn't smiling, but the tension in his face eased, as if he'd been waiting for someone else to carry the weight. The silence stretched again, thicker than before. Someone in the front row shifted nervously. Phones hovered high, glowing like stars in the dim corners. Chuck didn't rush. He let the demand hang heavy. Then he leaned in closer, the gesture small but final. The camera caught everything, the narrowing eyes, the faint curve of a smile that was colder than words. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't humor. It was precision, sharpened into an expression. The audience felt it. The room froze. For a heartbeat, the air itself seemed to still. That single look, the tilt forward, the cutting half smile, was captured by every lens. Screens lit up in the first rows with notifications, clips already escaping into the world before the host could close the segment. And in that instant, the balance shifted. The reporter wasn't the star anymore. He was part of the backdrop to an image already multiplying across feeds, destined to live far beyond the studio. The studio cracked open into chaos. What had been a show dissolved into noise, applause clashing with boos, nervous laughter colliding with shouts. The host froze mid-sentence, cue cards wilting in his grip. The floor manager gave up signaling. Every face in the crowd was lit by the glow of phones, screens lifted to capture the fire. The reporter leaned into it. He raised his mic like a weapon, grin stretched wide. "Mr. Seagal," he called over the din, "you do understand your movies are a circus, right? You wouldn't last a minute with a real fighter." The line detonated. Seagal's chair toppled as he stood. The bang of it on the stage floor cut through everything. Security sprang up in the aisles, dark suits flashing under the lights, hands half ready to restrain. A boom mic jerked upward, retreating from the blast radius. The audience went feral, half cheering, half panicked. The sound of 1,000 instincts clashing. Someone yelled Seagal's name. Another shouted, "Do it!" The control booth barked for a commercial cut, but the feed stayed live. Seagal's face burned under the lights. His chest heaved, eyes locked on the reporter. His fists twitched open and closed. He took a step, then another. "Sit down," a guard muttered from the wing, too soft for the cameras. Seagal didn't hear, or pretended not to. The reporter smirked, mic held like a dare. "There it is," he said too loud. "There's the act." The noise peaked. And then, the camera found Chuck. He hadn't moved through any of it. While Seagal bristled and the reporter thrived on sparks, Chuck sat still. Until... Now, he raised one hand, The effect was instant. The roar collapsed row by row, like dominoes of sound falling in sequence. Front seats hushed first, then the middle rows, then the balcony. Security paused mid-stride. Even the host lowered his cue cards. Seagal froze. He looked at Chuck, not the hand, but the eyes above it. What he saw wasn't threat, and it wasn't comfort. It was command. The reporter tried to speak, but his words came out thin, swallowed by silence. His grin faltered. Chuck held the hand aloft 1 second longer, as if balancing the room in his palm, then lowered it back to his knee. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Visually, the contrast was brutal. The reporter, loud, leaning forward, his voice breaking with effort. Seagal, rigid, chest heaving, seconds from boiling over, and Chuck, quiet, immovable, the calm center of a storm. The audience obeyed the silence. People sat back down without realizing. Phones lowered. The tension didn't vanish. It thickened, but it was ordered now, contained by something heavier than noise. Seagal's fists loosened. He remained standing, but stopped advancing. His jaw twitched once, then stilled. He was still burning, but the fire no longer spilled. The reporter adjusted his tie, forcing a laugh. "We're just talking," he said, voice pitched too high. "It's only television." He wanted the crowd back on his side, but the faces staring at him weren't laughing. Chuck's gaze slid toward him, slow as a door closing. It wasn't anger. It was judgment, quiet and exact. The kind of look that exposes bluster for what it is. The cameras loved it. Every lens locked on his face. In the booth, a producer whispered, "Don't cut," and the order held. Seagal shifted, shoulders easing by a fraction. He hadn't sat, but he'd accepted the boundary. The reporter raised his mic again, but his hand shook, betraying him. The room noticed. A ripple of recognition spread through the audience. The loudest man on stage was suddenly the weakest. Chuck leaned forward slightly, only enough to put weight in the air. He still hadn't spoken, but the promise of words, when they came, hung over the studio like the pause before thunder. The audience was ready. Phones hovered again, but nobody shouted now. They waited, not for the reporter, not for Seagal, but for Chuck. One breath passed, then another. The silence stayed loyal to him. And when Chuck finally drew in air, the studio bent toward it as if the answer itself could decide what happened next. The studio leaned as one body. You could hear the buzz of the lights, the faint tick of a wristwatch, the shallow breath of the reporter behind his microphone. Seagal's chest rose and fell too quickly. The audience barely moved, but their silence had become a living thing. Chuck rose. No drama, no flourish. He stood as though from a dinner table. Simple, steady. Yet the room's geometry changed. Every camera tilted up. Every head in the audience followed. He walked forward slowly, not toward the crowd, not toward the lens, but straight toward the reporter. The man tried to meet him with a grin. It broke almost instantly. His lips kept shaping confidence, but the eyes betrayed him. He lifted the mic higher, like a shield. Then came the last desperate strike. Volume. "You know what?" the reporter barked, voice cracking. "Both of you are legends only in the movies. In real life, you're nobody." The words cut the air raw. Some people laughed nervously, others winced. Security tensed. Seagal froze where he stood, face tight, fists half clenched. Chuck stopped in front of the reporter. The difference in height became a verdict. One man standing, one man seated. Chuck's gaze was level, his presence unmoving. The silence after those words was unbearable. He spoke softly, but the room leaned to catch it. "Real life isn't the cameras," he said. "It's what you do when no one's watching." He let it hang there, not for effect, but to give weight to the truth. Then he added, steady as before, "And right now, millions can see the difference between a man and a clown." No shout, no gesture, just words, dropped like a stone in still water. At first, the audience froze. Then the reaction broke loose. A whoop from the balcony, applause in the front rows, a cheer that spread until the whole room was on its feet. Phones rose like a forest of screens, recording, sharing. By the time the echo hit the rafters, clips were already bouncing through feeds. The reporter's face burned. He tried to smile, but it twisted, faltered, collapsed. His microphone lowered, useless in his hand. Cameras captured the moment his grin turned into something closer to panic. The host exhaled into his lapel mic, loud enough to be caught. The prompter kept scrolling useless jokes, ignored. In the control booth, someone whispered, "Don't cut, let it ride." Seagal sat down slowly. His fists opened, shoulders loosening. He looked at Chuck, and for the first time that night, his face softened. He didn't speak, but the gratitude was visible. The crowd was no longer divided. The chant started in one corner, "Chuck! Chuck!" and rolled across the studio like a wave. Strangers clapped each other on the back. People cheered until their throats went raw. Chuck didn't acknowledge it. He let the chant pass over him. He stayed still, his presence enough. He had no need to raise his arms or claim victory. His control, his calm, was victory itself. The reporter shifted in his seat, tugging at his tie. He tried to straighten his shoulders, but the attempt looked pitiful, a child's sketch of bravado. The crowd saw it and responded with louder jeers, louder cheers, until his effort was drowned. The cameras loved every angle. Chuck standing, the reporter shrinking, Seagal steady once more, the audience erupting. It was bigger than the show now. The moment had escaped the studio, already rewriting headlines. Chuck stayed on his feet long enough for the weight to settle. Then, with no rush, he turned, walked back to his chair, and sat. No gesture, no nod, nothing to suggest performance. The chant kept going, louder, more unified, until the host tried to speak and gave up. He stacked his cards, lowered his eyes, and let the ovation roar. The reporter stared into his microphone as if it could save him. It didn't, and above the chaos, one truth settled clear. The hardest strike of the night had been thrown, and it hadn't come from a fist. For a few seconds after the ovation peaked, the studio vibrated like an engine running too hot. Shouts collided with claps. Metal chair legs screeched as people rose without realizing, and the cameras kept their lenses locked in place, unwilling to miss a single frame. The storm of sound finally thinned into ragged bursts. Scattered whistles here, a cheer there, until it left behind only a charged silence, the kind that hums in the walls long after thunder moves on. The reporter tried to act as though nothing had happened. He straightened his back, smoothed his tie, and forced a grin that cracked at the corners. His cheeks glowed red, the flush creeping up his neck in front of millions. He fiddled with his microphone, fingers turning the foam cover in circles, a tick so obvious the audience read it instantly. To the cameras, it wasn't confidence. It was a man stalling for breath after being knocked down without contact. "Great television," he muttered into the mic, voice tight and brittle. We love a spirited debate." He tried for laughter, but it came out hollow, bouncing once and falling flat. The line didn't buy him time. It only underlined how little of it he had left. Seagal, who had been braced for an explosion only minutes earlier, let go of the air trapped in his chest. His exhale was audible even through the din, rough at first, then steady. The tension in his shoulders bled out as he lowered himself into the chair again, palms open on his thighs. His head tipped slightly, not to the reporter but to Chuck. "Thank you," he said, soft but caught by his lapel mic. 2 words, plain and unscripted. They echoed louder than shouting. The audience shifted, a collective murmur rippling across the rows. Some clapped quietly, others smiled. Not at spectacle, but at relief. A woman dabbed her eyes with a folded program. A man who had booed earlier folded his arms, not out of anger, but in resignation that he'd just witnessed something beyond entertainment. Then the chant reignited. It started like a spark in the balcony. "Chuck, Chuck!" Dozens of voices caught it, then hundreds, until it rolled like a drumbeat through the rafters. This wasn't hunger for conflict anymore. It was gratitude, almost reverence. People held their phones high again, trying to trap the moment inside a glowing rectangle, though most knew instinctively it was bigger than their screens could hold. Chuck didn't rise to greet it. He didn't wave or bow. He sat, composed, hands resting on his knees, his face unreadable but calm. The refusal to perform was itself a performance, a lesson in control. Cameras lingered on him because restraint had become the story. The host glanced his way, relief breaking across his features like someone watching a fire finally burn itself out. In the control booth, producers stopped barking orders. Monitors showed a collage of reactions. The reporter shrinking in his seat. Seagal's face softened. The crowd transformed from rabid to reverent. A director's voice crackled over headsets. "Stay on, Chuck. Hold. Let it breathe." The reporter made one last attempt. He forced his smile wider and tried to reframe. "Strong opinions on all sides," he said, lifting the microphone again. His tone wobbled. "We respect everyone here, of course." He trailed off, because even he could hear how false it sounded. The silence afterward was more brutal than boos. It was the silence of dismissal. His shoulders sank. For the first time all night, he stopped trying to sell anything. He shuffled the notes on his lap, papers he hadn't once used, and stacked them carefully as though neatness might restore dignity. It didn't. The crowd, sensing the surrender, eased its roar into a softer rhythm. Applause came like a tide withdrawing. People sat back down. The room exhaled. What had been a battlefield turned into a place of quiet recognition. Seagal leaned toward Chuck again. His voice dropped low, but the cameras still caught it. "You didn't have to," he said. Chuck shook his head. "Yeah, I did." No emphasis, no pause for effect. Just truth, spoken the way he always spoke. Simple, direct, final. The audience felt it in their bones. They began to clap again, not in frenzy, but in rhythm, steady and unified. This wasn't celebration, it was agreement. In the wings, security loosened their stances. A boom operator let out a breath and flexed his cramping hands. A lighting tech feathered the brightness down a notch. The blinding glow that had made every bead of sweat visible now seemed unnecessary, even cruel. The host shuffled his cards once, then gave up and laid them flat. Headlines were already being written in real time. Chuck Norris drops line that silences reporter. The knockout wasn't a punch, it was a sentence. Respect versus ratings, the studio chooses. Phones buzzed across the first rows with live notifications. Clips looped, captions screamed. By the time the broadcast ended, the internet had already crowned its winner. The host cleared his throat and leaned into his mic. His voice was measured now, stripped of TV gloss. "We came tonight to talk about craft and careers," he said, his eyes flicking toward Chuck. "Sometimes the lesson arrives differently. We thank our guests, and we thank you." The theme music rose, soft at first, then swelling into the outro. The floor manager gave a countdown with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The red tally lights blinked to black, and the broadcast was over. But the moment wasn't. In the room, people didn't leave right away. They clapped longer than usual, savoring the afterglow. Two teenagers swapped clips of the same line from opposite sides of the stage. A woman hugged her friend and whispered, "That's going to be everywhere tomorrow." A man in an expensive suit shook his head and laughed at himself. He had cheered the reporter earlier. Now he was chanting Chuck's name. On stage, Seagal extended his hand. Chuck took it. No squeezing for the cameras, no theatrics. Just a firm shake, one breath long, then released. The crowd applauded the gesture like closure. The reporter glanced down at his microphone, then up at Chuck. He gave a small nod. Not defiance, not defeat, just acceptance. Chuck returned it with the same economy of movement. Even, balanced, done. When the last of the audience filtered into the night, the studio was stripped back to what it had been hours earlier. Cables coiled, chairs folded, the stage a bare platform. On a forgotten monitor, one frozen image lingered. Chuck seated again, composed, while the reporter stared at his useless microphone. No sound, no caption, just a picture that already belonged to history. Outside, the air was sharp and cool, a relief after the heat of the lights. People poured into the street buzzing, retelling what they had seen, already shaping it into legend. Headlines hardened online, clips spun through feeds. Think pieces started forming in newsroom drafts with titles like When Silence Won and The Authority of Calm. The reporter walked out a side door alone, notes clutched under his arm. He would still be invited onto shows the next day, because humiliation sells as well as victory. He would talk softer for a while. He would replay the moment in his head, hearing the crowd roar not for him, but against him. Seagal walked out with Chuck. They didn't pose, didn't wait for cameras. Seagal glanced sideways once. "That line will follow you forever," he said. Chuck shrugged. Better than most things. They kept walking. No lights followed them. The applause was already behind them. What remained was the lesson. The hardest strike of the night wasn't a punch. It wasn't anger. It wasn't spectacle. It was a sentence, spoken calmly, and it landed harder than anything the audience had expected to see. And in living rooms across America, millions replayed it. Not to watch a fight that never happened, but to feel again the exact second when noise lost to respect.